Today we're continuing our story of the Roman Republic, and we're going to center our focus around the year 46-44 BCE, around the life and times of a man named Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar represents one of the great turning points in history, specifically a transition point when the Roman Republic ceased to be a republic and began its transition to become the Roman Empire. This is a pretty long story, but a pretty famous story. So we're going to start off reviewing what the Roman Republic was all about, how it changed, and what its governing features looked like as a result. Though the Roman Republic stood for centuries, over time, tensions developed that had to do with the way power was structured inside the Republic and the way conquest, conquering more and more and more land, changed the Republic and began to cause some problems, namely civil war. But first, let's review. We learned before that the Roman Republic was designed with separate branches of government in response to its previous history having been ruled by a king and never ever wanting to be ruled by a tyrant ever again. Leading this republic were two consuls, so like the executives, who served for 1 year, presided over the Roman Senate, and commanded the Roman military. Crucially for this story, remember that in times of crisis, one consul could become dictator for a period of 6 months in kind of an emergency situation. So like in an emergency, you don't want to wait for the slow gears of democracy to churn to make decisions. You want to be able to rely on one leader to make decisive action. And that was kind of the idea behind this provision of a dictator position for a consul. But the idea was that it remained temporary for 6 months, only to get the Republic through a crisis, after which dictators were supposed to relinquish their power. In addition, the landed elite, the aristocracy, people who were wealthy because they owned land and whose family names were powerful because they could trace their histories to the founding of Rome, they had the most political power, with members making up the Senate, and those were lifetime appointments. The governing structure also had a branch for commoners, people who we would now see as something like the middle class. And they had representation in the assembly, although less representation than the upper class. Society in the Roman Republic was rigidly divided by class. There was low social mobility. It was really, really, really hard, if not impossible, to move up in class or status. It was also strictly patriarchal, so men held all the power. At the top of the social hierarchy was that class of landed aristocracy, wealthy nobles. Now, the most power and the most wealth. The commoners in Rome were called plebeians, and they were like small landholders, artisans, and they represented the majority of the population. They also provided the majority of soldiers for the Roman army. And though they had some voice in government in the assembly, conflict between them and the landed aristocracy for representation would kind of characterize the Republic. Only aristocracy and commoner classes were considered to be citizens with rights. Beneath them in the social hierarchy, there was a lower class called the proletariat, who had no rights, followed by slaves, who were technically possessions. Rome was heavily dependent on slave labor. The Republic as such stood strong for several centuries, but as Rome's power and territory grew, internal conflicts began to emerge as citizens and families struggled for power. Ultimately, different factions emerged, loyal to either the patrician or the plebeian classes, or to a specific military general. So people stopped being loyal to the Republic in general and kind of picked their loyalty to either their class or, if they were in the military, their specific general, because the success of their general determined the military's salary. Over time then, a series of civil wars began to plague the Republic. A lot of this comes down to the way that a culture of conquest and triumph changed Rome. As Rome, the Republic, began to expand its territory, generals and the army became incredibly powerful. They held a lot of sway with the people, the lower classes. They occupied a huge spot in the popular imagination. And that began to raise the question, where does power come from? Is it from family, prestige, wealth, access to political power in the Senate? Or does it lie in the loyalty of soldiers and the masses of commoners? Second, conquest for resources led to more conquest for more resources, because the bigger territory you have, the bigger an army you need, and then you need to pay for more people, for more soldiers. And the easiest way to feed an army is to conquer more land and just kind of take stuff from other people. A third was conquest, and that created competition for work for the lower classes. So it required even more conquest to keep Rome fed, because the rich could ignore the poor to a certain extent, but there were so many poor. This is a trend in world history, that you can only ignore them so much. If they all get angry at the same time about the same thing, bad things can happen if you're, in the ruling class. So that kind of tension was going to cause a problem eventually. And then finally, like long-standing theme in Rome, the more territory they conquered, the more tension developed between the Romans and the people, the tribes outside of the borders of Rome, who Romans called barbarians. This created an interest pretty typical of empires, in that at a certain point, the source of power also became the source of Rome's greatest weakness. This is typical of empires. The bigger the border you get, the more problems you get, just because you have to defend a larger border. Think of it like a rubber band that kind of stretches. As you stretch it past a certain point, it becomes weak and then it snaps. More border territory to defend means more soldiers, so you have to pay them, so you have to conquer more land or raise taxes at home, which makes everybody at home angry, so conquering turns out to be easier. But then it creates a situation where you need even more soldiers for an even bigger border, creating a need for even more conquest. Class conflict became problematic in this process as well. Officially, the rich had power, but the poor have bigger numbers. And if the poor, like I just said a minute ago, all get angry about the same thing at the same time, it can cause huge problems for the rich. And slave labor was a source of a lot of tension. Third, shifting power structures began to corrode the Republic. At first, it was just your family name and your ownership of land that gave you power. That was like your ticket to the Senate, to political representation, etc. But as the army became more and more big and more celebrated, the army itself became an independent source of power. All the more so because Rome paid its army out of conquests. So the people who fought in the army increasingly weren't loyal to Rome as an idea. They were loyal to the general that won battles that led to their being paid, right? So like a successful general led to happy soldiers, so soldiers were loyal to their generals. In the civil wars that began to plague the Republic, a trend emerged where generals backed by their loyal soldiers would threaten to topple the Republic, which they said had grown corrupt, and it was, and the unhappy masses of poor people would tend to agree. And this is not a sustainable situation for a limited democracy, for sure. If you have a look at the map, look how big Rome grew from its early history in the Italian peninsula. It had conquered most of the Mediterranean basin, and the parts highlighted in green on this map are conquests owed to one super successful general. The man who came, he saw, he conquered. It was his motto, Julius Caesar. During this general time of civil war, a prominent general and statesman named Julius Caesar began amassing a lot of power. His soldiers were loyal to him, and he had access to a lot of wealth after having conquered a province they called Gaul. Now we call it France. He was charismatic, he was popular with the poor, and he was publicly against the political corruption of the upper class, the elite. That corrupt upper class, the Senate, clearly saw Caesar's power as a threat, and they began to demand that he gave up command of his army and come back to Rome as a private citizen, not as a general. Caesar refused and marched his army south from France directly into Rome. As a result, another civil war erupted between Caesar and the person who had been his political rival at the time. His name was Pompey. Caesar emerged victorious and was named dictator for life. Previously, the title dictator had been given to an appointed and temporary leader during emergencies. Caesar kept it. He never gave back that power. And so in that moment, when he became dictator, Rome ceased to have any separation of powers. It stopped being a limited government and became something else. Leaders within the Republic feared Caesar would become a tyrant with his new title, and a group of senators, most famously Brutus, but others too, conspired and assassinated him in the Senate by stabbing him over 20 times. In response to Caesar's death, his nephew and heir, named Augustus, who was like 19 years old when Caesar died, another teenagers making history moment, defeated the conspirators, and then established himself as the first Roman emperor. And he was pretty good at it, surprisingly, but that's a story for tomorrow. So Julius Caesar raises a few questions for us as historians. Man of the people, a successful general, troops on his side, against corruption. Did he save a corrupt republic from itself? Was the republic in fact already dead? Or did he kill it? Did he ruin democracy in Rome? Similarly, more questions that we can ponder through looking at Caesar's story. In the short term, having a strong, capable leader can help establish peace in times of crisis, but there are downsides. What are those downsides? And we arrive at our key points. So what we're focusing on in this lesson is the transition, the turning point, when Rome stops becoming a republic, when Caesar becomes dictator, and, as we'll see tomorrow, becomes the Roman Empire. We've seen that as Rome expanded its borders by conquest, it gained land, resources, power, and new problems. Those new problems include, but are not limited to, it is hard to rule conquered populations. Nobody likes being conquered. They weren't like especially friendly to the Romans either after having been conquered. So that in itself was a challenge. Second, imperial expansion extended slavery, expanded the wealth of the aristocracy, diminished the authority of a free peasantry, and generally contributed to the fall of the Roman Republic. In other words, the rich got richer, the poor got poorer. It became unsustainable. Internal unrest and shifting power structures within the city of Rome destabilized its traditional governing structure, and differences began to be settled violently rather than by political means, diplomatically. The big turning point that we're looking at was Julius Caesar. During a time of civil war, a popular general named Caesar became the sole dictator of Rome, challenging the idea of separation of powers. At that point, Rome stops being a republic. Having expanded its borders by conquest to include diverse populations, and having eliminated democratic, republican structures of government in favor of a single powerful ruler, the Roman Republic became the Roman Empire, and Augustus, Caesar's heir, became Rome's first official Roman emperor.